Life has a way of teaching us lessons we never asked for. Sometimes those lessons arrive slowly, over many years, wrapped in small disappointments and quiet realizations. But sometimes they arrive all at once. Cold, clear, impossible to misunderstand. And more often than not, the people delivering those lessons are the same ones who once promised they would never leave you. I learned that truth on a Tuesday morning when I was 20 years old. At the time, I believed my family loved me. Not perfectly, perhaps, but genuinely. I believed that if life ever knocked me down hard enough, they would be the people who helped me back up. Looking back now, I realize how strange that belief must sound. Because by the time that Tuesday morning arrived, life had already knocked me down several times. And each time, my family had simply stepped aside and watched me fall. But the human mind is very good at protecting itself from uncomfortable truths. We explain things away. We excuse people. We tell ourselves stories that make disappointment easier to swallow. It took me a very long time to understand that sometimes the story you tell yourself about your family isn't the story they're living at all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start somewhere quieter. My name is Lauren Mitchell, and when I was 20 years old, my life had already begun unraveling in ways I hadn't expected. A year earlier, I had been a college sophomore studying communications at a small state university 2 hours from the town where I grew up. I wasn't the best student, but I wasn't failing either. I had friends, a part-time job, at a bookstore. The kind of life that feels ordinary when you're living it, but comforting when you look back later. Then my mother got sick. Nothing dramatic at first, just fatigue, headaches, doctor visits that were supposed to be routine, but somehow kept multiplying. By the end of that semester, she had been diagnosed with a neurological condition that required long-term treatment. My father, who had worked at the same insurance company for nearly 25 years, suddenly found himself drowning in medical bills and paperwork. And in families like ours, when something difficult happens, everyone quietly falls into roles. My older brother, Kevin, lived across the country in Seattle. He called occasionally, but distance made him more of a concerned observer than an active participant. My younger sister, Chloe, was still in high school. She cried often, but wasn't expected to carry much responsibility. And me? Well, I was the one who came home. I withdrew from school halfway through the semester and moved back into my childhood bedroom. At the time, it didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt like the natural thing to do. My mother needed help. My father was overwhelmed. Someone had to be there. So I told myself I would only stay for a year. Just long enough for things to stabilize. Just long enough for my mother's treatment plan to settle into something manageable. Just long enough for everyone to catch their breath. Funny how the word temporary can stretch into something much longer when you're not paying attention. The next year of my life passed in a blur of hospital visits, prescription pickups, insurance phone calls, and late-night conversations at the kitchen table. My mother was often too tired to leave her bed. My father worked longer hours than ever. And Chloe was 17 and trying very hard not to think about any of it. So most of the daily responsibilities slowly drifted toward me. Not because anyone ordered me to take them. That's important to understand. No one ever sat me down and said, "Lauren, you are now responsible for everything." It just happened. When the pharmacy called about a prescription refill, they called my phone. When the hospital scheduled appointments, they spoke to me. When my mother felt frightened in the middle of the night, she knocked on my bedroom door. And for a while, I didn't mind. Helping people you love can feel meaningful. It can make difficult days feel purposeful. The problem is that purpose sometimes disguises something else. Expectation. And expectation has a way of growing quietly, day by day, month by month, until one day the thing you once offered freely becomes something everyone assumes you will always provide. By the time my mother's health began improving the following year, something in our household dynamic had changed. Subtly, almost invisibly, my father had grown used to me managing things. Chloe had grown used to not being asked to. And Kevin had grown used to hearing updates from a safe distance. One evening during dinner, my father looked up from his plate and said something that seemed harmless at the time. "You're good at handling things, Lauren," he said. "Better than most people your age." I remember smiling, because compliments from your parents always feel nice. But there was something else hidden in the way he said it. Something I didn't fully recognize then. Pride mixed with relief. Relief that someone else had stepped in to carry the weight. Not long after that, things began changing again. My mother's health stabilized enough that she no longer needed constant supervision. My father received a job offer from a company in Arizona. It was a promotion, better salary, better benefits, the kind of opportunity that people usually celebrate. At first, the news felt exciting. The whole family sat around the dinner table talking about desert landscapes, warm winters, and the possibility of a fresh start. Chloe was thrilled at the idea of moving somewhere new for her senior year. My father talked about housing prices and career opportunities. My mother seemed hopeful for the first time in months. And me, I assumed I would be going with them. After all, I had been the one keeping things together during the worst of the storm. Why wouldn't I be part of the new beginning? But sometimes the most important decisions in a family are made in rooms you're not invited into. And sometimes you don't realize those decisions have been made until it's already too late to change them. The morning I discovered my family had moved away, without me started like any other. The house was unusually quiet when I woke up. At first, I assumed everyone had left early for errands or appointments. That wasn't unusual. I patted down the hallway in my socks, expecting to smell coffee brewing in the kitchen. Instead, the house smelled like cardboard. That was the first strange thing I noticed. The second was how empty the living room felt. The couch was gone. The bookshelf that had stood against the wall since I was a child, gone. Even the framed photos that used to sit on the mantel had disappeared. For a few seconds, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It felt like walking into the wrong house by mistake. But then I saw the envelope sitting on the kitchen counter. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting. Just 2 words. Lauren. No love. No explanation. Just my name. My hands were already shaking by the time I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 3 sentences. That was all. I still remember every word. Lauren, we've decided it's time for a fresh start in Arizona. You'll figure things out. You always do. That was it. No address. No phone number. No invitation. Just a quiet assumption that I would somehow manage. Because apparently that was what I did. I stood in that kitchen for a long time after reading the note. Not crying. Not yelling. Just standing there. Sometimes shock doesn't look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like silence. Eventually, I sat down at the table where we had eaten thousands of family dinners over the years. And slowly, very slowly, a strange realization began creeping into my mind. They hadn't left in a hurry. The house had been carefully packed. The furniture had been moved. The pictures had been taken off the walls. All of that takes planning, time, conversations, which meant something far more unsettling than the note itself. They hadn't abandoned me impulsively. They had planned it. And somehow, during all those weeks of packing and preparation, No one had thought it necessary to include me in the conversation. Not my father, not my mother, not even Chloe. I wasn't someone they had forgotten. I was someone they had decided not to bring. And the most chilling part of all was the sentence my father had written at the bottom of that note. "You'll figure things out." At the time, I thought those words meant he believed in me. It took me many years to understand what he actually meant. But that realization would come later. Much later. Because on that Tuesday morning, sitting alone in a half-empty house, I had a far more immediate problem. I had no family, no savings, no plan, and no idea that the decision they had made about my life would follow me for the next 15 years. And what I didn't know yet was that one day the same people who walked away so easily that morning would come back expecting something from me, something they believed I owed them. But that part of the story didn't begin until much later, long after I had learned how to survive without them, and long after I discovered the real reason they had been so certain I would never make it on my own. There is a particular kind of silence that settles into a house after everyone has left. Not the peaceful kind, not the quiet that comes with a calm evening or a lazy Sunday morning. No, this kind of silence feels hollow, like something important has been removed from the air. I noticed it almost immediately after reading my father's note. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen. A car passed somewhere outside on the street, but inside that house there was nothing. No footsteps upstairs. No sound of my mother coughing in her bedroom. No music drifting from Chloe's room the way it usually did when she was getting ready for school. Just emptiness and the slow, creeping understanding that none of them were coming back. For a long time, I sat there at the kitchen table staring at the piece of paper in front of me. 3 sentences. That was all it had taken for my family to remove themselves from my life. 3 sentences after 20 years of being their daughter, 20 years of birthdays, holidays, family dinners, hospital visits, late nights helping my mother when she couldn't sleep. I remember turning the paper over, half expecting there to be more written on the back. Some explanation, some detail I had missed, but there was nothing, just blank white space. It was strange. You would think that a moment like that would trigger some kind of dramatic reaction. Crying, anger, panic. But the truth is, I mostly felt confused, because abandonment doesn't always feel like cruelty at first. Sometimes it just feels like a mistake you're waiting for someone to correct. I remember thinking, maybe they had to leave quickly. Maybe my father's new job started sooner than expected. Maybe they planned to call me once they got settled. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation waiting somewhere just outside my understanding. Human beings are remarkably creative when it comes to protecting the people they love, even when those people have done something difficult to defend. By mid-morning, I had checked my phone at least 20 times. No missed calls, no text messages, no emails. I tried calling my father. The number went straight to voicemail. I tried my mother's phone next. Same result. Then Chloe. Again, voicemail. That was when the first thin thread of unease began to tighten in my chest. Because if this had been some kind of rushed departure, someone would have answered. Someone would have explained. Instead, it felt like the entire family had quietly stepped out of reach at the exact same moment, as though disappearing had been part of the plan all along. Around noon, I finally walked through the rest of the house. Every room looked strangely unfamiliar. Without furniture or personal belongings, the space felt larger, colder, almost like an empty rental property waiting for its next tenants. My parents' bedroom had been completely cleared, closets empty, dresser drawers pulled open and wiped clean. Even the small framed photo of our family that had sat on my mother's bedside table for years was gone. The only room that still contained anything was mine. My childhood bed, my desk, a few boxes of books from college, a closet filled with clothes that suddenly felt like they belonged to a different version of my life. It didn't take long to understand why. Everything that belonged to them had been taken. Everything that belonged to me had been left behind. And that realization carried a quiet message that felt far louder than the note on the kitchen counter. They hadn't just moved. They had closed the door. Later that afternoon, I called Kevin in Seattle. For a moment, I hoped he might explain what had happened. Maybe he had convinced our parents to take the job in Arizona. Maybe he knew something I didn't. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Lauren," he said casually. "Everything okay?" His voice sounded relaxed, unconcerned, which meant he clearly had no idea what I had just discovered. "Did you know they moved today?" I asked. There was a pause on the line, not a shocked pause, not the kind that comes when someone hears unexpected news, more like the pause someone makes when they're deciding how much to say. "Yeah," Kevin replied slowly. "They mentioned something about leaving this week. Something about leaving, as though our entire family relocating across the country was a minor detail in conversation. And you didn't think to tell me?" I asked. Another pause. "Well, I assumed they talked to you." There it was, that subtle shifting of responsibility, the quiet implication that the situation must somehow be the result of miscommunication rather than intention. "They left me here, Kevin," I said. "They moved to Arizona this morning and left a note telling me to figure things out." For the first time, his tone changed. Not dramatically, just slightly more serious. "Lauren, you're 20. The way he said it made the sentence sound like an explanation. "You've been managing things for the family for years," he continued. "You're good at taking care of yourself." I remember staring at the empty kitchen wall while he spoke, trying to understand what he meant, or maybe trying to understand what he didn't mean. "So that's it?" I asked quietly. "They just leave, and that's normal to you?" Kevin sighed softly. "Look, Dad probably figured you'd want to stay here anyway. You've got friends, a job. Your whole life is here." That was the moment something inside my mind shifted, because Kevin wasn't shocked. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even particularly surprised, which meant he had already accepted the logic behind what had happened. To him, it made sense. And if it made sense to him, then chances were the rest of my family had seen it the same way. I ended the call shortly after that, not because I had run out of questions, but because I was beginning to understand that answers might not make things better. Sometimes explanations only confirm the thing you were hoping wasn't true. That afternoon, I sat on the front porch watching the quiet suburban street where I had grown up. Children rode bicycles past the house. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Life continued exactly the way it had the day before, except my family was gone. And the strange part was, no one else seemed to notice. Neighbors waved politely as they walked by, the same way they always had, as if the empty driveway and dark windows were perfectly normal. By evening, a more practical problem began forming in my mind. The house wasn't ours. It had always been a rental, and rent required money. Money that my father had always paid. For the first time that day, panic finally started pushing its way through the confusion, because the note on the kitchen counter hadn't mentioned anything about the lease, or the bills, or the dozens of small responsibilities that suddenly had no one attached to them. "You'll figure things out." The words sounded different in my head now, less like encouragement, more like dismissal, almost as if my father had written them knowing exactly how much chaos they would leave behind. Night fell slowly over the house. I ate a bowl of cereal for dinner because it was the only thing left in the kitchen. Then I sat in the living room where the couch used to be and stared at the empty space where our television had once stood. My entire life up to that moment had been built around the assumption that my family and I were moving through life together. Even when we disagreed, even when things were difficult, we were still a unit, a group. But now that assumption had been removed, and what remained was a question I had never considered before. What does someone do when the people they believed would always be there quietly decide not to be? That night, lying awake in the only bedroom that still contained furniture, I replayed my father's note over and over in my mind. 3 sentences, each one carrying a little more weight than I had realized that morning. We've decided it's time for a fresh start. A fresh start. Without me, you'll figure things out. Because apparently, that was my role, the one who handled things, the one who adapted, the one who managed whatever problem the rest of the family decided not to deal with. At the time, I still believed that role had been assigned out of confidence, out of faith in my abilities. It would take many years before I understood the darker possibility, that perhaps my family hadn't trusted me to survive. Perhaps they had simply been comfortable risking it, but that realization belonged to the future. On that first night alone in the empty house, I was still holding on to one fragile hope, that once they arrived in Arizona, once the stress of the move settled, once they realized how abrupt their departure had been, someone would call, someone would apologize, someone would say the words that could still repair the damage. I fell asleep believing that tomorrow might bring an explanation, believing that families didn't truly abandon each other without reason. But morning has a way of clarifying things that hope tries to soften. And when the sun rose the next day, no one called, no one wrote, no one came back. And slowly, quietly, a much colder truth began settling into my life. My family hadn't left because they thought I would be fine. They had left because they believed something else entirely, something far more unsettling. But that truth wouldn't reveal itself until many years later, after I had already learned how to survive without them, and after they returned expecting something they believed I owed them. The first week alone was the quietest I had ever experienced in my life. Not the gentle, comforting quiet of early mornings or snowfall. No, this was heavy, hollow, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do next. The refrigerator hummed its usual tune, the wind whispered through the trees, but nothing else moved. For the first time in decades, I realized how much of my life had been spent responding to other people's needs rather than living my own. Bills I hadn't seen in years were suddenly in my hands. Utilities, rent, insurance, all overdue or soon to be. The note from my father, once innocuous, now felt like a declaration. You'll figure things out. I stared at it again, thinking maybe, just maybe, I could make it a joke. But the more I looked, the less funny it became. Because here's the thing about abandonment. It forces you to realize that the people you trusted to handle life alongside you never intended to. They had left, completely, and they expected me to simply continue. The first challenge came in the form of the rent notice. I had always relied on my father to pay it on time, a lifetime of habit, of letting him handle the grown-up responsibilities, left me unprepared. The phone call with the landlord was short, polite, professional. "Lauren, the payment hasn't cleared," he said. I stammered, explaining, hoping my tone sounded more competent than I felt. I'll get it in by tomorrow. I promised, because promising felt safer than admitting the truth that for the first time, I had no safety net. Food became another challenge. I had grown used to the cupboards being stocked, the fridge filled, the meals prepared by someone else at some point during the week. The first grocery trip alone was a revelation. Everything seemed larger than life. The aisles stretched endlessly. Prices leapt out at me, and I realized how much I had taken for granted. How much my family had assumed I could navigate life without fail, because I always had. It was exhausting and lonely. Weeks passed. Slowly, the rhythm of survival replaced the rhythm of habit. I learned which bills could wait, which groceries lasted longer than a day, how to fix a leaky faucet without panicking, how to negotiate with the landlord without breaking down in tears. Every small victory felt monumental, and every failure cut sharper than I expected, because the people who should have caught me weren't there. But the deeper wound wasn't practical. It was the psychological cruelty of being left behind. I remembered every small remark, every expectation, every subtle assumption from my childhood and young adult years. How I had always been the dependable one, the one who handled things, the one who didn't complain. And now that role had been weaponized, not out of malice, at least not explicitly, but out of convenience. I realized that my family had left because they had quietly assumed I could handle anything. And when they finally tested that assumption, it was my turn to discover how far it could stretch. The first major test came at the end of the month. The landlord had reached the limit of patience. No more extensions, he said firmly. My heart sank. Everything I had managed so far, bills, groceries, the endless balancing act was about to fail. And I was completely alone. No one to call for help. No one to blame. No one to explain it to, except myself. It was in that moment, standing in the small, silent living room, that I realized something fundamental. I was no longer living in someone else's expectation of me. I was responsible only for myself. For the first time in decades, that felt terrifying and liberating, because while they had left me physically, they could no longer define who I would become. I had the first real choice of my adult life, and for the first time, I began imagining a life beyond their assumptions. A life where I could survive, where I could thrive, where I could stop carrying a role I never truly wanted. But transformation is never immediate. It begins with small, almost imperceptible steps. That night, I didn't sleep much. Instead, I made a list, not a list of chores, not a list of obligations, a list of what I could control, bills I could pay, food I could buy, things I could fix, and most importantly, the boundaries I could start to set. It was modest, imperfect, barely a blueprint, but it was a start, a whisper of the woman I could become. And though I didn't know it yet, that whisper would grow louder until one day it became a roar. The morning the eviction notice arrived, something inside me shifted. Not a small shift, not the subtle nudge of reality whispering, "Pay attention." No, this was sharp, brutal, like a blade cutting away the comfort I had clung to for decades. For the first time, I really understood what it meant to be abandoned, not temporarily, not because of circumstance, but deliberately. I sat at the kitchen table with the notice in front of me. It was official, typed on crisp paper. Deadline, 7 days. No exceptions. My hands shook slightly as I picked up the phone to call my father. I hesitated. For a fraction of a second, I almost convinced myself that he would answer, that he would say something reassuring, something that would make this nightmare temporary. But the line rang and then went to voicemail. I left a message anyway, polite, calm, professional. "Dad, I received the notice. I need your guidance." No response. Hours passed. Nothing. By midday, I realized what I had already known deep down. They weren't coming. Not Daniel. Not Laura. Not Rachel. Not my parents. No one. And that's when a strange clarity washed over me. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional. They had left me to fail alone. Memories began to return. Small, almost insignificant at the time, but now glaringly obvious. Daniel's casual comments over the years. Maggie will handle it. Laura's jokes. That's why we have Maggie. Rachel's casual assumptions. Mom said you'd take care of it. All of it. Every single one. Carefully orchestrated. And now, after decades of silent manipulation, the mask had slipped. They had abandoned me for their convenience. Not because I wasn't loved. Not because they were incapable. Because they assumed I would always be the one to carry their burdens. And now, I was proving them right. The first real confrontation came unexpectedly. Daniel called later that evening. I could hear the faint hum of a city in the background, his new life, his apartment, his career, everything he had built while I stayed behind. Lauren, he began casually. Lauren, I corrected sharply. That had been my name before Maggie became the role, before I became invisible. Yes, he said, unbothered. I just heard about the notice. Don't worry. Mom and Dad said. I cut him off. Don't say don't worry. Don't say they have a plan. Don't you dare assume anything about me. There was silence on the line. Then, Lauren, I didn't realize it would. You didn't realize? I hissed. You left me to fail. All of you. And you didn't realize. The line went quiet again. Then he hung up. That night, I made my first bold decision. I would pay the rent myself. Every last penny. I would buy groceries myself. I would fix the broken things myself. Not because I had to. Not because anyone expected it. But because I finally realized I had spent my whole life letting others define what I could do, what I should do, what my life was for. And I was done. Over the next few days, I worked frantically. I balanced bills, negotiated payment plans, mopped floors, fixed leaks, cooked meals for myself, things I had done for decades for everyone else, now done solely for me. And with each small victory, I felt something awakening inside me. Something fierce, something untouchable. I was no longer Maggie, the dependable daughter, sister, and caretaker. I was Lauren, the woman who had been waiting in silence for her own life to begin. But just as the first sense of freedom began to bloom, another realization hit me. This abandonment, this carefully crafted silence, it wasn't just about convenience. There was another reason they left me. Something darker, something intentional. And I was about to uncover it, because when you have spent a lifetime being the family's shadow, the truth has a way of finding you. It started with a letter, not an email, not a text, not a casual note slipped under the door. A real letter typed on crisp stationery, addressed in my mother's careful handwriting. Though the words inside were far from maternal, I found it tucked behind a stack of old bills, the kind of place you only look when something in your gut tells you to. And my gut was screaming. The letter was short, brutally efficient. It explained, in careful detail, why I had been abandoned, why no one called when the eviction notice arrived, why my siblings never checked in except for casual favors, why my parents never intervened. Because in their minds, I was meant to fail. Their reasoning was chilling in its simplicity. Lauren has always been dependable. She will pick up the pieces. She will handle it. She will never complain. She will never challenge us. She will not demand her share. And if she succeeds, it is irrelevant to us. If she fails, she will learn humility. Humility. That word burned across the page like acid. They had planned this entire scenario decades in the making, to prove something to themselves. They weren't just neglectful. They were cruel by design. I sank into the kitchen chair, letter trembling in my hand as the full weight of it settled in. Every favor I had done, every moment I had sacrificed, every quiet act of care, it had been used against me. All those years, they didn't love me the way I had believed. They needed me. And when I was finally inconvenient, when my life didn't serve them in the way they expected, they abandoned me. I remembered the tiny cracks, the little comments that had seemed harmless. Daniel saying, "You'll handle it like always, right?" Laura laughing, "Maggie's the glue that holds us together." Rachel shrugging, "Mom said you'd take care of it." It wasn't love. It was control. And they had been testing me all along. The letter wasn't finished. The final lines were the cruelest. "We always believed you would not rise above your responsibilities. And yet you have. That is disappointing. We expected humility, not independence. We expected you to return to us, begging. We expected you to fail. That you didn't is unacceptable." I read the last line over and over. That you didn't is unacceptable. The audacity, the sense of entitlement, the psychological cruelty, calculated, intentional, and precise. I could feel it reach through the paper, through the years, through the roles I had been forced into. They had never wanted me to succeed. And now that I had, they were angry. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full spectrum of betrayal. Anger, shock, hurt, rage. It wasn't the sort of betrayal that you can forgive easily. It was meticulously planned. It was something meant to break me, to prove I was still the girl who existed solely for their convenience. And yet, something else had shifted. I wasn't that girl anymore. I thought about every favor I had done, every sacrifice, every meal cooked, every errand run. And for the first time, I realized none of it belonged to them. It belonged to me. And if they wanted to see me fail, well, I had already stopped playing their game. But freedom comes with a price, because once you see the extent of someone's cruelty, you cannot unsee it. And once you realize the truth, you must decide how far you are willing to go to claim your life back. That night, I made another decision. I would not just survive. I would rise. Not for them, not for anyone, but for myself. And in that moment, I understood something I had never dared to imagine. The family I thought I had never truly existed. They were never protectors, never allies, never champions. They were only obstacles, carefully disguised as love. The next morning, I woke up with a strange clarity. The kind of clarity that feels sharp, almost dangerous. For decades, I had moved through life as if I were invisible, helping, fixing, cleaning up, smoothing edges, always quiet, always steady, always Maggie the dependable. But the letter had lit something in me, and that morning, I decided the game was over. The first step was small, almost imperceptible. I stopped answering their calls immediately. Daniel called about a medical appointment. I let it ring. Laura texted about sending the kids over. I ignored it. Rachel asked if I could pick up something for my father. I didn't reply. The silence felt dangerous, both to them and to me, and it felt good. They began to notice. Daniel's voice was tight when he called the following day. "Maggie, are you okay?" I answered lightly, "I'm fine. Busy, you know?" He paused, the way someone does when they realize they've lost control over a situation they thought was guaranteed. "Right, okay." It was the first crack in the armor. Then came the invitations I no longer accepted. The family dinners, the casual favors, the small, harmless requests that were never harmless. I started saying no, sometimes gently, sometimes sharply, and every no felt like a tiny rebellion a reclamation of something I hadn't realized I had lost: my voice, my time, my autonomy. I began making decisions for myself, not them. I enrolled in courses I had postponed for years. I took a short trip to the mountains alone, something I had never allowed myself because family emergencies always seemed to appear. I even bought a small place of my own, a quiet apartment downtown where no one could call me at 7 a.m. to handle something. And with every choice, the weight I had carried for decades began to lift. Of course, they noticed. Daniel called again, frustration creeping in. Mom and Dad were wondering why you didn't take them to the cardiologist. I stayed calm. They can manage. You're all capable adults. He stuttered. I just thought. Thought what? I asked. My voice was steadier than I expected. I thought, you just handle it, he admitted, the words tasting bitter even to him. Laura's response was subtler, but no less telling. She texted, "Are you really going to let them manage on their own?" I replied, simply, "Yes, they're fine. You worry too much about me." She never responded, and that silence was sweeter than any compliment I had ever received. Rachel, the youngest, was the most unpredictable. She called to ask me to fix a minor problem at home, a plumbing leak. I paused. It was tempting. Old habits die hard. But then I remembered every favor, every sacrifice, every expectation disguised as love. "No," I said calmly but firmly. "It's your responsibility. Figure it out." Her silence on the line spoke volumes. For the first time, I could see the panic ripple through the family. It wasn't just that I was refusing to help. It wasn't just that I was reclaiming my time. It was the realization dawning on them. My life did not belong to them anymore. And that panic, it was intoxicating. Because finally, I felt power. Power that had never been mine before. Not in the obvious way, not in a way they could recognize. I didn't just survive their cruelty. I threatened it. That night, as I sat in my quiet apartment with a glass of wine, Winston curled at my feet, I realized something terrifying. The family that had abandoned me, the family that had planned my suffering, was beginning to fear me. And in that fear lay my ultimate advantage. Because once someone fears you, they reveal their true intentions. And I intended to watch closely, to see every misstep, to see every scheme unravel, to understand fully, at last, just why they left me. The first Real crack appeared on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I had returned from work, my apartment smelling faintly of the candles I'd started lighting, a small ritual I used to mark boundaries in my life. And then the phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice was sharp, urgent, the sort of tone people use when they're on the edge of losing control. "Maggie, Mom, Dad, something's come up. They need you." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I sat down at my small kitchen table, Winston at my feet, and I let the silence stretch long enough for him to squirm. "I'm busy," I said finally. "What is it?" Daniel's pause was telling. They found some documents, he stammered, some old files from Dad's work, things about the inheritance, and they thought you'd never see them. Something clicked. All the years, the favors, the expectations, the quiet manipulation, they hadn't just relied on me because I was dependable. They had relied on me because they assumed I would never challenge them. And for decades, I hadn't. Until now, I told Daniel I'd come over, not because I wanted to help, not because I was scared, because I wanted to see for myself. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense. My parents sat stiffly in the living room. Laura hovered near the doorway. Rachel had her arms crossed, eyes flicking between all of us. And then they handed me the folder, a simple manila folder. I opened it slowly. Inside were letters, bank statements, and old legal documents, proof of something I had never imagined. Proof that for years they had actively worked to keep me from knowing the truth. They had hidden money in my name. Investments, property deeds, opportunities one could have had decades ago. All of it quietly, carefully withheld, because in their minds, I was incapable. I would fail. I would never succeed. And if by some miracle I did, they believed I would come crawling back, grateful for whatever crumbs they decided to throw my way. I looked up, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in their eyes. Not subtle fear, not fleeting fear, real fear, the kind that comes when someone you've underestimated finally sees the full picture. Why? I asked quietly. My father opened his mouth, closed it again. My mother's hands trembled. Laura and Rachel looked as though they wanted to disappear. We were protecting you. My father said finally, protecting me? I repeated. My voice was sharp now, cold. By hiding my life from me? By keeping me from everything I worked for? From everything I could have had? There was silence. And in that silence, I realized they had underestimated me. They had spent decades trying to shape me into the perfect, dependable daughter, the one who never questioned, never rebelled, never claimed what was hers, the one who would quietly shoulder all expectations. But I had stopped being her. I don't want your protection, I said, finally, my hands steady as I laid the documents back on the table. I want my life, every bit of it, the opportunities you thought I would fail at, the things you tried to keep from me. I will decide what to do with them. Not you, not ever again. I stood up. Winston padded behind me, sensing the shift in energy, and then I walked out. The family that had abandoned me, the family that had hoped I would fail, the family that had quietly plotted my limitations, they were powerless now, because I had finally claimed what was mine. Not just the documents, not just the opportunities, but myself. And as I closed the door behind me, I knew one thing for certain. They had expected me to stay small, quiet, obedient. They had expected me to crumble under their subtle cruelty. They had expected me to never see the truth, but I had seen it, and now I was unstoppable. The first thing I did was sit down with a cup of tea, not for comfort, not for ritual, not to calm myself. I drank it slowly, savoring each sip, letting the warmth settle in my chest like fire waking after a long winter. Because today was the day I stopped being the person they expected me to be. I began with small steps. I contacted a lawyer, not to argue, not to plead, not to negotiate, simply to claim what was legally mine. The investments, the properties, the accounts, all of it long hidden, all of it mine by right. And for the first time, I felt the weight of possibility pressing against my ribs. I wasn't just reclaiming things. I was reclaiming time. Opportunities that had been stolen, years I had given away quietly. Daniel called first. Margaret, Maggie, you can't possibly. I interrupted, and I will. The years you thought I'd waste, I'll make them count. There was a pause. I could almost hear the surprise, the fear, the betrayal leaking through the phone. You've changed, he said finally. No, I said, I just stopped being who you wanted me to be. Laura sent messages, polite at first. Polite, then frantic. Are you serious? Can we talk? I didn't answer immediately. When I did, it was short, measured. I don't need to talk to anyone who tried to decide my life for me. I'll handle things my way. Even Rachel, the baby they'd always protected, the one who had once relied on me, without question, she hesitated before speaking. Margaret, Rachel, the only thing you owe me is respect. I said, And right now, I'm deciding what that looks like. And with that, the family who had abandoned me, the family who had quietly hoped I'd fail, had nothing left to hold over me. I began selling the investments I didn't need. I developed projects I had only dreamed of. I bought the property I had always wanted. I traveled. I experienced. I lived. And every time my phone rang with a call from them, I felt no panic, no obligation, just power, because they had expected compliance. They had expected weakness. They had expected the quiet, dependable daughter to stay small. But I didn't. One evening, months later, I returned home from a meeting with a potential investor. Winston greeted me as usual, tail wagging. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window. The sky had a bruised, purple glow, clouds hanging low, the kind of evening that feels like the world is holding its breath. And I smiled. For the first time in decades, I was untouchable. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. Not exactly. I was free. They had underestimated me. They had hoped I would fail. They had never imagined I would rise. But I had. And that rise, that power, was delicious. Sometimes my siblings try to reach out now. Some with apology. Some with thinly veiled requests. I listen. I respond if I want to. I ignore if I don't. Because the truth is simple. The dependable daughter no longer exists. The quiet caretaker no longer exists. The one they thought they controlled, she's gone. And the one who remains, she's unstoppable. Life has a way of teaching lessons we never asked for. And sometimes the people who say they love you are the same ones who leave you in the shadows, hoping you won't shine. I learned that lesson. I faced it, and I didn't just survive it. I thrived. My dear, if you stayed until the end, then you understand something most people never realize until decades later. Not every ending is a loss. Some endings are shields. Some endings are the moment you finally stop being someone else's plan. My name is Auntie Jo, and around here, we don't rush these stories. We let them unfold the way life actually does, through quiet dinners, hidden expectations, whispered disappointments, and the women who learn, sometimes too late, that being dependable doesn't mean being owned. Before you go, sit with this. If the people who were meant to care for you abandoned you for their convenience, would you follow them or take back your life? Can love survive when it was quietly weaponized against you? And have you ever discovered your own power only after someone assumed you had none? Think on these, my dear. Tell me what you would do. I read every word. And if you want more stories where justice isn't shouted, but felt in every quiet victory, subscribe. Your next story is already waiting.